In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free. If a Negro baby is born, and this is true also of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, he has about one-half as much chance to get through high school as a white baby. He has one-third as much chance to get through college as a white student. He has about a third as much chance to be a professional man, about half as much chance to own a house. He has about 4 times as much chance that he'll be out of work in his life as the white baby. I think we can do better.
President John F. Kennedy has been celebrated for many different aspects of his short time in office, but perhaps the most significant of these was his contribution to the American Civil Rights Movement. While Kennedy's assassination prevented him from passing any real legislation himself, by the summer of 1963 the president had come to terms with the importance of the movement and fully embraced it, something none of his predecessors had ever done before. Many disagree over whether Kennedy's intentions were truly moral or if it was simply good politics, but in any case, Kennedy played a larger role in the conflict over civil rights than any previous president since Lincoln. In the years following the emancipation of slaves after the Civil War, the African American community immediately became a huge target of violence and discrimination. Racist groups like the Ku Klux Klan would lynch, beat, and intimidate blacks with virtually no repercussions from the law. In fact, the law seemed to almost endorse this, through the establishment of Jim Crow laws in the South, which institutionalized racial segregation. After decades of oppression with little progress, an organized movement began to emerge during the early 1940s, and became more and more organized throughout the 1950s. Influential new leaders emerged, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1954, a landmark court case, Brown v. Board of Education, made segregation in public schools illegal. Protests started to become more effective, most notably with the success of the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956. In 1957, the president directly intervened in the enforcement of civil rights legislation for the first time. President Eisenhower was forced to send in the military to ensure the safe entry of 9 black students to Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas to enforce the Brown v. Board of Education decision. That same year, he signed into law the first Civil Rights Act since the Reconstruction era, but it was too flawed to make a significant impact. Towards the end of Eisenhower's presidency, Senator John F. Kennedy began the campaign for the 1960 election, using civil rights as a platform to attract African American voters.
If a Negro baby is born there and a white baby is born next door, that Negro baby's chance of finishing high school is about 60% of that baby's. His chance of getting through college is about a third of that baby's.
He has one-third as much chance to get through college.
During his televised debate with the Republican candidate Vice President Nixon, he used the exact same talking points. Although he pushed for civil rights on the campaign trail, once elected, it took some time for President Kennedy to fully commit to the movement. Kennedy won the election by an incredibly thin margin, and at first was hesitant to risk losing Southern support. It wasn't until a series of incidents that occurred from late 1962 to June of 1963 that President Kennedy began to feel pressure to explicitly state his feelings on the matter. Despite the 1954 court ruling that stated that so-called separate but equal schools were unconstitutional, in the near decade since then many schools remained segregated.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it.
Kennedy ordered troops to enforce the desegregation of the University of Mississippi in late September 1962. Riots had broken out on campus to prevent James Meredith from becoming the first African American to enroll there, but he was escorted by federal troops the next morning. On Good Friday of 1963, following mass protests in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. King was arrested. From his jail cell he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, urging white moderates to act in the interest of civil rights rather than being satisfied with the status quo. At the same time, Birmingham protests continued, and a children's crusade, in which black youths peacefully protested, were met by extremely violent resistance from law enforcement. Photos and footage of the brutality was broadcast throughout the nation and the world, forcing Kennedy to once again send in federal forces. Another school soon became an issue. Alabama State University also had remained segregated. When 2 African American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, tried to enroll, Alabama Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway to block them, accompanied by state troopers. The situation was a repeat of what had happened at Little Rock 6 years earlier. This clash of state government with federal law, on top of the previous events from months earlier, made it necessary for Kennedy to respond in a different way than he had before. Kennedy once again sent in troops to ensure the admittance of the students, but this time he also did something that forever changed the way his presidency was to be viewed.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
He also showed exceptional leadership in becoming the first president to morally denounce segregation of the races and drafting the first draft of what would ultimately become, after his death, of course, the Rights Act of 1964.
By addressing the nation on television, Kennedy went beyond merely enforcing the law and instead appealed to the morals of the people to gain their support for it. His address elevated the issue from a purely political or illegal one to an ethical one, something no prior president had done.
Well, once again, Kennedy was a trendsetter when it came to putting social issues first and foremost in the minds of all Americans. Of course, we had FDR with the New Deal, but that was for different reasons, mainly economic reasons. Kennedy wanted to deal with civil rights, and that was his agenda from the very beginning.
In the same speech, he announced the drafting of a new piece of legislation, another civil rights bill. Kennedy proposed that the bill should include greater enforcement of ending segregation in public facilities and education, as well as stronger protection of the right to vote for all Americans. From this moment on, history would largely remember Kennedy as the first true civil rights president. 2 months after this, on August 28th, Kennedy supported the famous March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech.
Justice, I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
While initially hesitant, the president decided he would try to control the protest to keep it peaceful in order to prevent any potential disruption in Congress to the proposed civil rights bill. After the event, Kennedy hosted King and other key figures of the march at the White House. On November 22nd of that same year, Kennedy was assassinated. Following his death, his successor Lyndon Johnson pushed forward civil rights legislation, citing it as a great eulogy for the fallen president.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
The resulting Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 fulfilled the words of Kennedy's televised address to the nation.
My lifetime has basically run the course of civil rights from 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education through the civil rights movement of the 60s through today. Kennedy did set the ideas, the tone forward for Americans. So without him, I don't think we would have made as much progress.
During a time when the country's focus was dominated by the Cold War, Kennedy brought the domestic issue of civil rights to the forefront. It could easily be argued that Kennedy only addressed the issue because of Cold War pressures. After all, the images of violence in Birmingham didn't exactly project the image of democracy that Kennedy had hoped to. It could also be argued that the only reason Kennedy ever campaigned under civil rights was to gain the African American vote, with no real intentions of acting on the issue. Whatever the case may have been, the actions that President Kennedy took and his decision to support the movement, both morally and legally, made it possible for future developments in civil rights to be successful.
But knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.